What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? When I wrote the first draft of this script, the video was about a flawed masterpiece. The idea that nothing is truly perfect, and that the flaws found in the greatest works are important to analyze. I still do think this, not as shock value or to be unique or something, but I truly feel like there is an objectively better version of this movie in a different reality. The message I wanted to convey is that The Dark Knight is not the ceiling for what can be done, and is not the only approach that can be done for a superhero film. I was tired of seeing video essay after video essay praising The Dark Knight, despite me loving this film, because it feels like nothing new is really being said. Like people will take the wrong message from the quote-unquote perfection of this film. My idea section for the script became crazy ramblings, trying to find a purpose in what the hell I was trying to say exactly. I watched so many interviews and an entire documentary, but they solidified how untouchable this film really is, and for a reason I must discover, that sort of angers me. Naturally, I want to go against the current and attempt to portray the unseen, that The Dark Knight is a masterpiece, but also absolutely isn't. Let me start by saying I am a massive fan of Christopher Nolan's work such as Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, and of course, the Dark Knight trilogy. Nolan may be hyped up to a ridiculous standard, but from my knowledge, he hasn't released a bad film yet. Well, I haven't seen Tenet yet, but we'll see. I love his integrity when it comes to the use of practical effects and using real film instead of digital. Nolan is a mysterious person I find who talks about his work in very technical ways, but rarely talks about them in terms of a personal lens, and I think he hides it. Maybe that's the right thing to do in his position, I'm not sure. What I do know is that it makes it difficult to derive the objective truth from The Dark Knight through the lens of its creator. It's not impossible, but it's very, very interpretable on purpose. The technical elements to the grand idea of the Dark Knight trilogy gives us enough to go off of. It's very clear, and I'm sure many other video essays have made it extremely clear, that this trilogy was in direct response to Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Nolan believes these movies did not take themselves seriously, and neither should the fans. There was a need to bring Batman back to the darkness, but also now to reality. When it came to Batman Begins, Nolan wanted an exaggerated American city, a place that feels real against the fantasy that is Batman. They were not aiming for a stylized and fantastical reality that was in Batman and Batman Returns. Batman Begins still felt a little stylized, especially with its polluted and slum-filled Gotham, but that changed in the next film. The Dark Knight's Gotham might as well just be Chicago, and that was entirely on purpose and admitted by its creators. The Dark Knight's aesthetic is completely stripped of its comic book origins. This purposefulness makes it difficult to criticize aspects surrounding the general direction. If you enjoy Tim Burton's fantastical Gotham and universe more than this trilogy, is that merely a subjective flaw? Can that be argued in any objective way? I think it is reasonable to say that even if you do something on purpose, it doesn't automatically make it completely void from criticism, but this film has the upper hand because its purpose is very admirable. I am convinced that Nolan wanted us to feel like this is a real-life event being broadcasted to us, that Joker is an actual domestic terrorist, and that he has caused havoc on the level of the real terrorist attacks of 2001, but why? Why would Christopher Nolan want to portray such an idea? What do we have to learn from replicating that chaos? Well, everything. Corruption, politics, war, morality, and everything in between those. This world asks very difficult questions. At what point do the consequences of Batman as a vigilante and as a symbol outweigh the fight against the moral decay and suffering of Gotham? When does Bruce take off that mask, and for whom? Are all people corruptible? Are all of our white knights doomed to fail, doomed to repeat the cycle of good and evil? Do our good-hearted efforts to protect and serve spawn the adverse, a Joker type? Were the efforts good-hearted in the first place? Are we destined to fight like animals in this never-ending loop of order and chaos? These questions are unanswerable. They come from the core of what it means to be a human being living in our current world. These questions drive us insane. We always need the puzzle piece to fit perfectly, but this time, it just never will. Nolan leaves these questions open-ended because everyone imagines their own hero in Batman's shoes, because Nolan's Batman won't be truly understood by everyone, and you always
fear what you don't understand.
The world Christopher Nolan made is a world where no one ever wins in the end, where nothing is absolute, nothing is perfect or black and white, where the characters suffer the same twisted, unfair reality that we live in. We care about these characters because they are not just characters, they are literally human beings, and they will always fail. The Joker is a character who lived in this cycle, who was fed up with the destiny of reality itself, but you can't imagine a reality without these themes, where these questions are answered truly because you can't see what's unseen, at least not in our current age. The Joker is desperately trying to escape this cycle of good and evil, to be ahead of the curve, but he ends up falling right back into it right here. This might be weird, but we enjoy watching a psychopathic murderer just like we admire a self-sacrificing hero, because both of them are stuck in the same exact prison you and I are in right now, and we will never ever find the keys. This is called existential dread. It is beautiful and painful at the same time, and always will be. That is the very point of these films, especially The Dark Knight, to make people aware of these traps and the questions sprinkled within the prison of reality, and that maybe, just maybe, one of us, one of the viewers, will find the keys. The Dark Knight is one of the most important works of art in our current age to be created. This admirable and objective purpose is the lens at which I can appropriately criticize this film, a film with solid armor. While nothing is truly perfect, The Dark Knight is indeed a masterpiece in the very compact lens it provided itself. But if this is objectively true, why does much of the fan base, including me, get so bothered by this sort of Batman story also? Here are some objective flaws and plot holes with The Dark Knight. How does no one care about the rubble-covered bus that just drove out of the side of a bank? How did the Batmobile enter the parking garage from the air? How did Lucius not get patted down by the security in Hong Kong? Why did Batman never return to the party after saving Rachel? Did Joker continue looking for Harvey? Why did he end up leaving eventually? Why did the GCPD want to take Reese out of the news building rather than just protecting and searching the entire building instead? And also, why did Reese come to the conclusion that Bruce Wayne is Batman rather than just that Wayne Enterprises works for Batman? How does the explosion at the MCU knock out and kill everyone except the Joker? How can Two-Face pronounce a P sound if he can't fully close his mouth? Why was Officer Stevens hanging out in the interrogation room with Joker instead of just watching him through the glass? On the Batpod, Batman shoots and blows up a few cars. How does he know there's no one in them? How did no one notice the tons and tons of explosives on the two ferries before they left the port? How did the Joker and his odd-looking henchman manage to be undetected at Loeb's funeral? And how did Joker manage to escape despite being surrounded by the entire police force? The big, strong, bad Batman is incapacitated by the Batpod sliding over somehow. Did Gordon have to fake having no pulse too when he quote-unquote died? Batman's bending/clawing gadget, whatever you want to call it, is kind of impractical and dumb looking, but I guess they didn't want Batman to be like Black Panther. But seriously, why would Batman bend the barrel of this guy's gun instead of disarming him and then taking it apart with his hands? I feel like if the guy got scared and pulled the trigger with a bent barrel, it might have combusted, which is what happens when a barrel is bent like that. How does this Maroni henchman get a gun into this heavily protected court? If this was through paying people off, why would you need it in the first place if you can just rig the entire proceeding in the first place? If it was to assassinate Harvey Dent, why do it in this extremely difficult way that could ruin Maroni's defense? Is Batman's voice really that scary or just kind of ridiculous? Does this fight choreography really show how skilled Batman is as a fighter? How does Batman fail to silently disarm Harvey Dent at the end? I think some of these are pretty valid, but here's the thing about most of these flaws. You don't really notice many of them when watching, and a lot of them just don't matter. It's impossible to make a story without any plot holes, at least a complex story like this one. And these flaws don't really take away from the main plot and or need to exist in order to further the plot or save screen time. I think it would have been nice, for example, if we learned where exactly Joker got his henchmen, and even to save screen time, it could have been told through environmental storytelling, maybe a newspaper about how there are a lot of Arkham patients still on the run from Batman Begins, or something like that. It's sort of told that way when Harvey captures one of the Joker's henchmen halfway through the movie, but since it's only one man, I don't find it that convincing. I think it would have been interesting to see how Nolan could solve some of these plot holes and flaws, but again, just because it isn't perfect doesn't mean it isn't great. They are flaws nonetheless. At this point, you may be wondering why I said this film absolutely isn't a masterpiece. What have I even said that goes against any current? This film franchise bothers me for a personal and subjective reason.
It did feel like a risk because, to a certain extent, with Batman Begins, you feel like you got away with it. You feel like you did manage to please people, so why mess with that? But we just had this story we wanted to continue. We just had this idea of who would the Joker be in this world, seen through the prism of Batman Begins? Who does that? Who is that?
It is repeated over and over that they got away with making these films so disconnected from the comic book aesthetic that it was necessary to tell the story Nolan wanted to tell, that these movies would change the comic book movie genre forever, that these movies would not be referred to as comic book films, but just simply films. When they say this, I know they don't mean it in a disrespectful way, cause I get it, Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, mini superhero films, and other blockbusters didn't take themselves seriously at the time as a part of a respected art form and that were solely made to sell toys. The Dark Knight trilogy is probably the most seriously taken superhero movie, but it wasn't the first serious and passionate superhero movie to exist. What bothers me is the indirect rejection of films like Batman, Batman Returns, the entirety of the Spider-Man trilogy, and the first two Superman movies. I love these films despite being cheesy sometimes, despite being a little jokey sometimes, because they were not just made to sell toys, but made from the vision of really passionate people who truly cared about what they were making. I feel like the change to the comic book movie genre that is being worded by the makers of the Dark Knight trilogy is admirable for making a believable superhero film for the purpose of telling a story, but is disingenuously convincing people that this was the first set of comic book movies that can be called a film and not just a comic book film, that this was the first set of comic book films that could be respected as true art. Even if it is worded vaguely, I still find it a bit offensive, especially to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man franchise. In the Dark Knight documentary, they act like this was the first movie people could feel truly personally affected by, yet Spider-Man 2 released in 2004, a year before Batman Begins. Sam Raimi's movies made me think, made me feel, they connected to personal things that happened in my life. Those films, at least the first two to many, are 100% art and should be respected as such. Batman and Batman Returns sets were entirely handmade, mini models were meticulously constructed. Tim Burton made the film darker than WB would have wanted because he had a vision, just like Christopher Nolan had. It seems more like people have a lack of respect for certain films, confusing them with soulless filmmaking, and the Dark Knight trilogy seems to indirectly aid that argument, and that bothers me. The way the team words themselves in the documentary sounds really pretentious, but it might just be there to give a feeling of confidence and importance. But I have no right as an 18-year-old boy who has next to no real experience to tell Christopher Nolan what he should have done. Thousands upon thousands of countless hours went into every single one of these films. They are so organized, technical, and precise, even if they don't always seem like it. Even the most simple shots in this film took longer than you would expect. It did show what could be done, even if it isn't the only way to do it. What also bothers me is the direction of the films. While they are admirable and I respect the unique direction, I do not personally think they absolutely needed to entirely strip the comic book aesthetic. I don't want people to think that the only way to make a serious comic book movie is to do that. I can't touch this film, I can't argue this objectively, but everyone knows how much I love detail and environmental design, and The Dark Knight is the epitome of mundane. Its sets are consistently concrete, boring glass buildings, and mundane, plain streets, but its lack of focus on style is entirely on purpose. If I were to categorize this into my macro and micro storytelling idea, this film would be the best example of art that focuses a lot on the very well-written macro storyline, but puts little thought into the unnecessary micro storytelling. What you get on screen in The Dark Knight is all you get. There's no sub-stories that expand off screen, there's no lore, there's nothing defined within the sets, not really at least. There's a few Easter eggs. I'm sure some thought went into the set design of this film, but it feels like it is the bare minimum requirements to assist the narrative. Micro storytelling is a good way to create immersion by making the art feel like it exists beyond what is directly presented to you. When the camera is turned off, that universe still exists in your mind, yet this movie is still immersive, and that's because it instead taps into realistic realistic aspects such as the existential dread that I mentioned before. Therefore, this movie isn't attempting to bring you into a fictional universe, it attempts to bring a fictional universe into your reality. Style means so much to me. My favorite films are stylized, and if I made a film, it would be the exact same. There are many storytelling benefits you can achieve out of a more stylized universe and less realistic scope. Many painters who became masters of realism realized later in life that arbitrary, non-objective work was just more appealing, or at least more expressive to them. Batman comes from a medium that is very expressive, telling stories of fiction that cannot possibly happen in real life, and showing messages and themes from that unique perspective. One of the biggest elements of art is color, which is also mundane in The Dark Knight. Of course, in the film, blue tints and the color of fire clash, symbolizing the main theme of the movie, order versus chaos, but that's really the extent of color in this film. In Memento, something Nolan also made, color is a massive aspect to that story. It is necessary for the movie, actually. Depending on what color a shot is in Memento determines the time frame and whether we are in first-person limited or first-person omniscient. This sort of storytelling is absent in The Dark Knight, and that's because of its direction. I absolutely adore the writing to this movie, but I absolutely hate the aesthetic of The Dark Knight, yet I also respect it so much. This film bothers me so much because it is a masterpiece, because this film happened to not be my perfect Batman film. Do you really want to know what objectivity truly is? Objectivity is a compromise of thought amongst people, at the consequence of subjectivity. The most interesting part about The Dark Knight to me is the end. It's great, the dialogue is so tense and pulls on the heartstrings. It calls back to the pain felt throughout the entire movie. Many foreshadows connect here. Every theme and question I mention is addressed and clashes. But you don't need me to explain that. It shows for itself. There's a decision in this ending that confused me, whether this was a flaw or if it was genius, a decision without a clear answer. Batman chooses to lie. Gotham believes he killed those people. He killed Harvey Dent in order to save the progress that Dent made. Up until now, it made no sense. Why would Batman lie? Why would he make another deal with the devil? Why would he give in? The entire movie, Batman, Gordon, Lucius, Rachel, they all made the wrong choices. They all decided to make compromises, whether that be for Bruce to bend the law to be a vigilante and to then want to turn himself in at the Joker's request. Gordon made do with a corrupt police department. Lucius exploited the public in order to help Batman stop the Joker. Rachel's selfish love for Dent blinded her from the bigger picture that Dent was telling everyone. Do not compromise. Because compromises continues the cycle. Compromise has consequences, and consequences is caused by compromise. We compromise because we believe in necessary evil. Compromise is the gray in morality. But you know what action makes compromise impossible? What removes gray from the entire equation? A coin flip. Because a coin does not land on its edge. Two-Face is tired of a world of compromise, something he is very much used to as a lawyer, but he doesn't try to escape reality's constant laws like Joker does. He's not trying to escape the cycle of good and evil, he has just stopped trying to influence it. Now he lets nature decide for him. So if compromise is so bad, if that is the possible theme for this film, why does our quote-unquote hero compromise yet again? Why has the Batman not learned the lesson? It may be because Batman isn't a hero, not just to Gotham through the great lie, but Batman truly isn't the hero in the story. Dent was. The Dark Knight is a tragedy, or maybe the theme is not merely a statement like do not compromise, but is actually the question, when do we compromise? You may think you get it, you may say you wouldn't compromise, you may think you are ahead of the curve, that you will make the right decisions, but truly, underneath, you are no different than the Batman, willing to take one last roll of the dice, one last compromise, endure. And despite knowing the consequences of these actions, maybe the good for the time being will outweigh the inevitable punishment, because the real world is gray. Even if the prison walls are black and white, and you might just get lucky. Sometimes our faith should be rewarded, lies told, not because of a greater truth, but because we are human, and it might just be better to forget about our existential prison only for a time, until we fight again. Good versus evil, the objective versus the subjective, the compromise and its consequence. Do you want to know what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The obvious. The two coexist, no matter how much friction occurs. Nothing will ever move, and this force of nature and this wall of ideology will never die. I don't think I will find the keys. But maybe one of us will.